This wasn't just research, it was a race for the human mind itself. Behind the Iron Curtain, in laboratories hidden from the world, Soviet scientists were pushing the boundaries of what consciousness could become. They didn't want to understand the brain, they wanted to control it. While the West celebrated victory in 1945, Moscow was already planning the next war, not with tanks or bombs, but with thoughts, dreams, and the electric whispers of the mind. This is the story of how the Cold War turned inward, how two superpowers battled not just for territory, but for the very essence of human will. The year was 1953. Stalin was dead, but his vision lived on in the sterile corridors of secret facilities scattered across the Soviet Union. Scientists in white coats worked around the clock, their eyes fixed on oscilloscopes, and their minds focused on a single question. Could brainwaves be weaponized? Could consciousness itself become a battlefield? What they discovered would change everything we thought we knew about the limits of human manipulation. The sleeping giant awakens. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union found itself in possession of something far more valuable than captured territory. German scientists, fleeing the collapse of the Third Reich, brought with them research that would make the atom bomb look primitive. These weren't just any scientists. They were specialists in something the Nazis had called neuropsychological warfare, the systematic study of how to break and rebuild the human mind. Dr. Vladimir Bekhterev had already laid the groundwork decades earlier with his reflexology institutes, but this was different. This was urgent. American intelligence agencies were reportedly making advances in psychological warfare, and Moscow couldn't afford to fall behind. The race wasn't just about nuclear superiority anymore. It was about something far more intimate and terrifying: the ability to reach inside a person's skull and rewire their very thoughts. Soviet researchers began with a simple premise: every human brain generates electrical activity. These brainwaves, they theorized, could be measured, mapped, and perhaps most importantly, influenced. If you could understand the electrical signature of fear, could you amplify it? If you could identify the neural patterns of loyalty, could you strengthen them? These weren't philosophical questions. They were operational objectives. The first breakthrough came in 1954 at a facility outside Leningrad. Dr. Yuri Kolodov, working with equipment salvaged from German laboratories, successfully demonstrated that electromagnetic fields could alter brain activity in laboratory animals. Rats exposed to specific frequencies showed dramatic changes in behavior. They became docile, aggressive, or confused based entirely on the electromagnetic signals directed at their heads. The implications were staggering, but animals were just the beginning. The real prize was human consciousness, and the Soviets were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to crack that code. They established what they called psychotechnical laboratories in major cities across the Union. These weren't hospitals or universities. They were research facilities with one purpose: to turn the human mind into a controllable system, the science of influence. Understanding how the Soviets approached mind control requires understanding their philosophy. Unlike Western researchers who focused on drugs and psychological manipulation, Soviet scientists believed the key lay in the brain's electrical activity. They called it bioelectric conditioning, and it was based on a revolutionary insight. The human brain, they realized, was essentially a biological computer, and like any computer, it could be programmed. Dr. Leonid Vasilyev, one of the leading figures in Soviet parapsychology, published papers describing how specific electromagnetic frequencies could induce states of hypnosis, anxiety, or euphoria. His work wasn't theoretical, it was practical, tested on volunteers from the Red Army and political prisoners who had no choice but to participate. The results were documented in classified reports that wouldn't see daylight for decades. The process was surprisingly simple in concept. Researchers would first map a subject's baseline brainwave patterns using primitive EEG equipment. Then, they would expose the subject to electromagnetic fields tuned to specific frequencies. What they discovered was that certain frequencies could override the brain's natural electrical patterns, essentially hijacking the neural networks responsible for decision-making, memory, and emotional response. One particularly disturbing experiment involved subjects being shown propaganda films while their brains were exposed to what researchers called enhancement frequencies. The subjects not only absorbed the propaganda more readily, but retained it with unusual clarity weeks later. When questioned, they couldn't explain why they suddenly felt such strong convictions about topics they had previously been indifferent to. Their minds had been quietly rewritten. The research wasn't limited to electromagnetic fields. Soviet scientists also experimented with infrasound, low-frequency acoustic waves that could penetrate buildings and affect large populations simultaneously. They discovered that certain frequencies could induce feelings of unease, panic, or submission in crowds. Imagine the possibilities. A weapon that could pacify an entire city without firing a single shot. But the most ambitious project was something they called psychic driving. This involved exposing subjects to repetitive messages while their brains were in altered states induced by electromagnetic stimulation. The goal was to implant new thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors so deeply that the subject would never question their authenticity. It was brainwashing elevated to a science. The human experiments. What happened behind the closed doors of Soviet research facilities remains largely classified, but fragments of information have emerged over the decades. Testimonies from former researchers, declassified documents, and the accounts of survivors paint a picture of systematic human experimentation that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics. Dr. Anatoly Smirnov, who worked at a facility in Siberia, later described experiments where subjects were kept in sensory deprivation chambers while their brains were bombarded with electromagnetic signals. The goal was to break down their existing personality structures and rebuild them according to predetermined specifications. Some subjects emerged from these sessions with completely altered memories of their past. Others suffered permanent psychological damage. The Soviets weren't just interested in controlling individuals, they wanted to understand how to influence entire populations. They conducted field tests in remote villages, exposing residents to low-level electromagnetic radiation through modified radio towers. The villagers reported unusual dreams, sudden changes in political opinions, and inexplicable feelings of loyalty to the state. These weren't coincidences. They were the results of carefully calibrated psychological warfare. One of the most chilling accounts comes from a former KGB operative who described a project called Operation Mindbridge. The goal was to create sleeper agents who genuinely believed they were loyal American citizens. These subjects underwent months of electromagnetic conditioning combined with false memory implantation. When activated years later, they would carry out their missions with complete conviction, never suspecting they had been programmed. The technology was crude by today's standards, but it was effective. Soviet researchers had discovered that the human mind was far more malleable than anyone had imagined. With the right combination of electromagnetic stimulation and psychological conditioning, they could rewrite someone's entire identity. The person would wake up believing they had always been someone else, complete with fabricated memories and artificial emotions. These experiments weren't conducted in isolation. They were part of a broader Soviet strategy to gain psychological superiority over the West. While American researchers focused on drugs like LSD and psychological torture techniques, the Soviets were developing something far more sophisticated. They were learning to hack the human operating system itself. The race intensifies. By 1956, American intelligence agencies had become aware of Soviet advances in what they termed psychotronic warfare. The CIA's response was swift and decisive. They launched their own research programs, desperately trying to catch up with what appeared to be a significant technological gap. The Cold War had entered a new phase, one where the battlefield existed inside the human skull. What the Americans didn't realize was just how far ahead the Soviets had already gotten. While Western researchers were still debating the ethics of mind control research, their Soviet counterparts had already developed operational weapons. They had devices that could induce specific emotional states in targeted individuals. They had techniques for implanting false memories, so convincing that even the subjects couldn't distinguish them from reality. The implications were staggering. If the Soviets had truly mastered mind control, they could potentially turn American citizens into unknowing agents, manipulate elections, or even prevent nuclear retaliation by psychologically paralyzing enemy commanders. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the race was just beginning. But the Soviets weren't content with laboratory successes. They wanted to test their discoveries on a larger scale, and they had the perfect opportunity. Political dissidents, prisoners of war, and anyone deemed an enemy of the state became unwilling subjects in experiments that would have horrified even the Nazi doctors they had recruited. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic programs designed to perfect the art of mental manipulation. The breakthrough came in 1957 when Dr. Semyon Terligin successfully demonstrated what he called neural entrainment. By exposing subjects to precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses, he could synchronize their brainwaves with external frequencies. The subjects would lose their ability to think independently, becoming temporary extensions of the transmitting equipment. They would follow commands without question, perform tasks they would normally refuse, and even act against their own survival instincts. This wasn't hypnosis or psychological conditioning. This was direct neural control, achieved through nothing more than invisible electromagnetic signals. The subjects remained conscious throughout the process, but their free will had been temporarily suspended. They were aware of their actions, but powerless to resist them. It was the ultimate violation of human autonomy. The Soviets called it bioelectric slavery, and they were rapidly perfecting the technique. They discovered that certain individuals were more susceptible than others, and they began developing psychological profiles to identify ideal targets. Children, they found, were particularly vulnerable. Their developing brains offered less resistance to electromagnetic manipulation, making them perfect candidates for long-term conditioning programs. The invisible war begins. While the world focused on nuclear weapons and space exploration, a shadow war was being fought in the realm of consciousness itself. Soviet agents, equipped with portable electromagnetic devices, began conducting operations in major Western cities. These devices, disguised as everyday objects like radios or briefcases, could influence the thoughts and emotions of anyone within their range. The first confirmed use of these weapons occurred in 1958 during a diplomatic summit in Geneva. American negotiators reported feeling unusually compliant during crucial discussions, making concessions they later couldn't explain. When intelligence agencies investigated, they discovered traces of electromagnetic radiation in the conference room. The Soviets had been broadcasting influence signals throughout the negotiations. This marked the beginning of what intelligence historians now call the Silent War. Unlike conventional warfare, this conflict left no visible casualties and no destroyed cities. Instead, it targeted the most fundamental aspect of human existence, the ability to think and choose freely. Diplomats made inexplicable decisions. Military officers experienced sudden changes in loyalty, and ordinary citizens found themselves with political opinions they couldn't remember forming. The technology was evolving rapidly. Soviet researchers had moved beyond simple electromagnetic pulses to complex waveforms that could target specific neural pathways. They could induce depression in enemy agents, enhance aggression in their own operatives, or create false memories in witnesses to sensitive events. The human brain had become a battlefield where thoughts were weapons and memories were casualties. Dr. Boris Rybakov, working at a facility in the Urals, developed what he called cognitive viruses. These were electromagnetic patterns that could spread from person to person through close proximity, creating cascading effects in target populations. A single infected individual could unknowingly transmit the signal to others, creating a network of influenced minds across entire organizations. The implications were terrifying. If the Soviets could create self-replicating patterns of mental influence, they could potentially control entire governments without anyone realizing they were being manipulated. Democracy itself could be undermined by invisible signals that shaped how people thought and voted. The human cost. Behind the clinical reports and scientific breakthroughs lay a human tragedy of unprecedented scale. Thousands of individuals had their minds violated, their personalities altered, their memories rewritten. Many never recovered from the psychological trauma of having their consciousness invaded and manipulated. Former subjects described the experience as living in a nightmare where their own thoughts couldn't be trusted. They would find themselves believing things they knew were false, feeling emotions that weren't their own, and taking actions that contradicted their deepest values. Some developed permanent psychological disorders, unable to distinguish between their authentic thoughts and those that had been artificially implanted. The research facilities themselves became prisons of the mind. Subjects were kept in isolation chambers where every aspect of their sensory experience was controlled. They were exposed to carefully designed electromagnetic fields that could induce specific brainwave patterns, essentially turning their consciousness into a laboratory instrument. Dr. Pavel Anokhin, one of the few researchers who later spoke publicly about the program, described seeing subjects who had been completely reprogrammed. They had new personalities, fabricated histories, and artificial emotional responses. They were the same people physically, but their minds had been fundamentally altered. They were living proof that human consciousness could be engineered like any other technology. The most disturbing aspect was how normal the subjects appeared. Unlike victims of physical torture, those who had undergone electromagnetic conditioning showed no visible signs of abuse. They smiled, laughed, and interacted socially, but their minds had been quietly hijacked. They were functional human beings with altered souls. The technology spreads. By 1959, the Soviet mind control program had expanded beyond research facilities to operational deployment. KGB agents carried portable devices that could influence targets during routine encounters. Embassy personnel used hidden transmitters to affect visiting diplomats. Even ordinary citizens were unknowingly exposed to influence signals through modified radio and television broadcasts. The Soviets had discovered that they could embed subliminal electromagnetic patterns in regular media transmissions. Television viewers would absorb propaganda not just through what they saw and heard, but through invisible signals that directly stimulated their neural pathways. The content of the programs became secondary to the electromagnetic frequencies that accompanied them. This represented a fundamental shift in the nature of information warfare. Previous propaganda efforts had relied on persuasive content to change minds. The Soviets had developed something far more insidious, the ability to bypass conscious thought entirely and directly manipulate the electrical activity of the brain. Intelligence agencies in the West began to notice unusual patterns. Diplomats who had visited Soviet facilities returned with altered perspectives on key issues. Journalists covering events in communist countries filed reports that seemed inconsistent with their previous work. Scientists attending international conferences found themselves inexplicably sympathetic to Soviet research programs. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. Anyone who spent significant time in Soviet-controlled environments risked having their consciousness quietly modified. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a psychological processing zone where minds were reshaped according to Soviet specifications. The Americans struck back with their own research programs, but they were already years behind. While they had been focusing on chemical and psychological methods, the Soviets had been perfecting electromagnetic techniques that were far more precise and difficult to detect. The mind control gap had become a national security crisis. the world begins to shift. As the 1950s drew to a close, the effects of Soviet mind control research were becoming visible on the global stage. Political movements in various countries began adopting positions that seemed to favor Soviet interests. Labor unions in Western nations became more militant without clear cause. Even religious organizations found themselves promoting ideas that aligned with communist ideology. The Soviets had learned to weaponize human consciousness itself. They could create political instability, influence elections, and shape public opinion through invisible electromagnetic signals. The traditional tools of diplomacy and warfare were becoming obsolete in the face of technology that could directly control how people thought and felt. But the technology was about to evolve again. Soviet researchers were on the verge of breakthrough that would make their previous achievements seem primitive. They were developing techniques that could permanently alter human consciousness, creating changes that would persist even after the electromagnetic influence was removed. The race for the human mind was entering its most dangerous phase, and the world would never be the same. The breakthrough that would define the decade came in December 1959, when Dr. Mikhail Persinger achieved what Soviet researchers had been pursuing for years. He successfully demonstrated permanent neural restructuring through electromagnetic exposure. Unlike previous experiments that produced temporary effects, Persinger's technique created lasting changes in brain architecture itself. The subjects weren't just influenced, they were fundamentally transformed. The process required exposing individuals to complex electromagnetic patterns for extended periods. These weren't simple frequencies, but carefully orchestrated waveforms that could target specific neural pathways. The brain, under constant electromagnetic pressure, would begin to rewire itself. New neural connections would form while existing ones weakened or disappeared entirely. It was neuroplasticity weaponized. The first successful test involved a captured American pilot who had been shot down over Soviet territory. After 3 weeks of treatment, he emerged with completely altered political beliefs and emotional responses. He genuinely believed he had been fighting for the wrong side. His personality had been rewritten at the cellular level. When questioned by American intelligence after a prisoner exchange, he passed every psychological evaluation. The changes were seamless and permanent. This wasn't temporary conditioning that would fade over time. The pilot's brain had been physically restructured. His neurons had formed new pathways that supported his altered beliefs. Even years later, he would defend Soviet policies with the same conviction he had once shown for American values. His mind had been architecturally redesigned. The implications sent shockwaves through the highest levels of Soviet leadership. If they could permanently alter human consciousness, they could create armies of converted enemies. American prisoners of war could be transformed into Soviet assets. Captured spies could be reprogrammed and sent back to their home countries as unwitting double agents. The possibilities were limitless. But the Soviets weren't content with individual conversions. They wanted to understand how this technology could be scaled up to affect entire populations. They began developing what they called demographic influence systems. These were large-scale electromagnetic transmitters that could broadcast restructuring signals across wide geographic areas. The goal was nothing less than the systematic reprogramming of enemy populations. The first field test occurred in a remote region of Eastern Europe. A small town of approximately 5,000 residents was exposed to low-level electromagnetic restructuring signals over a period of 6 months. The results exceeded all expectations. The population gradually shifted from skeptical of communist ideology to actively supporting it. Local elections saw communist candidates winning by unprecedented margins. Most remarkably, the residents couldn't explain their changing political views. They simply felt they had always held these beliefs. The technology was evolving beyond simple belief modification. Soviet researchers discovered they could alter personality traits, emotional responses, and even basic cognitive functions. They could make aggressive individuals docile, turn introverts into extroverts, and enhance or diminish intellectual capacity. The human mind had become as malleable as clay in their hands. Dr. Alexei Kozyrev, working at a facility in Kazakhstan, developed techniques for implanting entirely fabricated skill sets. Subjects could be given false memories of training they had never received, creating instant experts in fields they had never studied. A factory worker could be transformed into a skilled engineer simply by implanting the appropriate neural patterns. The process bypassed years of education and experience. The most disturbing application involved what Soviet researchers called identity replacement. They could completely erase an individual's sense of self and replace it with a manufactured personality. The subject would retain their physical appearance and basic motor functions, but everything else would be artificial. They would have new memories, new relationships, and new loyalties. They would be the same person physically, but someone entirely different mentally. The program expanded rapidly throughout the early 1960s. Soviet facilities across the Union were conducting experiments on an industrial scale. Thousands of subjects were being processed through electromagnetic reprogramming systems. The technology was becoming refined, standardized, and terrifyingly efficient. The moral implications were staggering. The Soviets had developed the ability to commit the ultimate crime against humanity, the theft of consciousness itself. They could take everything that made a person unique and replace it with something of their own design. It was murder of the soul while leaving the body intact. The Western response was desperate and often misguided. American intelligence agencies launched crash programs to develop countermeasures, but they were working from incomplete information. They didn't fully understand the electromagnetic nature of Soviet techniques, leading them to focus on chemical and psychological defenses that were largely ineffective. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, while horrific in its own right, was primitive compared to Soviet electromagnetic conditioning. American researchers were still trying to break minds through drugs and trauma, while the Soviets had learned to rebuild them through precise electromagnetic manipulation. The technological gap was becoming a chasm. Meanwhile, Soviet agents equipped with portable reprogramming devices were operating in major Western cities. These devices, disguised as everyday objects, could begin the restructuring process in targeted individuals. A brief exposure during a casual encounter could start changes that would develop over weeks or months. The victim would never know they were being transformed. The devices were incredibly sophisticated for their time. They could analyze the target's brainwave patterns in real time and adjust their output accordingly. Each person's neural architecture was unique, requiring customized electromagnetic patterns for effective restructuring. The technology could adapt to individual differences, making the process more efficient and less detectable. Business leaders, politicians, and military officers began experiencing subtle changes in their thinking. They would find themselves more sympathetic to Soviet positions during negotiations. They would make decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but later appeared inexplicable. The electromagnetic influence was so gradual that most victims never realized they were being manipulated. The technology was becoming increasingly miniaturized and portable. Soviet researchers developed devices that could be concealed in jewelry, eyeglasses, or even clothing. An agent could carry a restructuring system anywhere without detection. The battlefield had become invisible and omnipresent. Dr. Yevgeny Livanov, working at a facility outside Moscow, achieved another breakthrough in 1962. He successfully demonstrated wireless power transmission for electromagnetic conditioning systems. The devices no longer needed batteries or external power sources. They could draw energy from radio waves, making them virtually undetectable and infinitely operational. This development transformed the scope of Soviet operations. Agents could deploy conditioning systems in target locations and leave them running indefinitely. Embassy buildings, hotels, and conference centers could be equipped with hidden transmitters that would influence anyone who entered. The invisible war was becoming total and permanent. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. The Soviets could now influence entire organizations through strategically placed conditioning systems. A hidden transmitter in a corporate boardroom could alter the decision-making processes of major companies. A device in a government building could affect policy discussions and voting patterns. Democracy itself was under electromagnetic assault. The human cost continued to mount. Thousands of individuals had their personalities systematically destroyed and rebuilt. Many never recovered their original identities. They lived as strangers in their own bodies, carrying memories and beliefs that weren't their own. Some developed severe psychological disorders when fragments of their original personalities surfaced unexpectedly. The research facilities had become factories of human transformation. Subjects were processed through standardized procedures that could reshape their consciousness in predetermined ways. The Soviets had developed psychological templates that could be applied to any individual, creating armies of identical minds in different bodies. The most tragic cases involved children who had been subjected to electromagnetic conditioning during their formative years. Their developing brains were particularly susceptible to restructuring, allowing for more complete personality replacement. These children grew up believing they were someone else entirely, with no knowledge of their true origins or identities. Dr. Nikolai Baratashvili, one of the few researchers who later expressed regret about the program, described the children as the most disturbing aspect of the research. They were perfectly normal in every way, except that their entire sense of self had been artificially constructed. They had no authentic memories, no genuine emotions, and no real relationships. They were human beings who had been manufactured rather than born. The technology was approaching a level of sophistication that would make detection nearly impossible. Soviet researchers were developing what they called stealth conditioning systems that could operate below the threshold of conscious awareness. The electromagnetic signals were so subtle that they produced no noticeable effects during exposure, but they would gradually accumulate over time to create significant changes in thinking and behavior. These stealth systems could be deployed in public spaces without anyone realizing they were being influenced. Bus stops, restaurants, and shopping centers could be equipped with hidden transmitters that would slowly condition everyone who passed through. The entire population could be gradually reshaped without their knowledge or consent. The implications for free will and human dignity were profound. If consciousness could be invisibly manipulated on a mass scale, then the very concept of individual choice became meaningless. People would believe they were making their own decisions while actually following programming that had been imposed upon them. The Soviet Union was creating a new form of totalitarianism that operated not through visible oppression, but through the invisible manipulation of thought itself. Citizens would support the state not because they were forced to, but because they had been programmed to want to. It was the ultimate form of control, achieved through the systematic rewiring of human consciousness. As the 1960s began, the world stood on the brink of a transformation that few could comprehend. The Soviets had developed technology that could fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. They had learned to rewrite the software of consciousness itself, creating people who were authentic in every way, except for the fact that their authenticity had been artificially constructed. The race for the human mind was entering its most dangerous phase, and the outcome would determine not just the balance of power between superpowers, but the very nature of human existence itself. The invisible war was about to become total, and humanity would never be the same.